Okay, you were just saying something further about the reaction of...
Yes, I mean, the reaction of, I think, a lot of people on the left to my material that you were, familiar with and using as part of your argument, was tricky because they realised that this was very carefully researched. I mean, it wasn't empirical analysis that was fragile in the way in which it had been put together. And oddly enough, I mean, the methodologies that I'd then developed for working with manorial court rolls were picked up by Hilton because he got a substantial grant in those days, which was in the old Social Science Research Council, to do more work on the exploitation of court rolls. So, and I just don't think that would have happened had the interest that you had, I think, generated in debate about the nature of English medieval social structure, particularly rural social structure. Because I remember Michael Anderson, who was then, I think, on the research board of the ESRC, he read my thesis, because it had been submitted, I think, as part of Hilton's case for getting quite a large grant to do a big survey of manorial court rolls. And of course I'd used some, probably wouldn't do it now, I'd used some sort of exchange theory to try to look at why brothers stayed together, or why certain people interacted in the court in a particular way. And it was partly stimulated by the way in which he'd used it to look at family relations in 19th century Preston, which I suppose is a sort of rather cavalier way of going about things. But I was interested in that aspect of Homan's work, actually, on exchange theory, which was very different from what he was doing when he was working on manorial sources. And he said to me that he was very supportive of that application because of what he read in the dissertation, and I didn't know him very well in those days at all. So there was sort of an irony, I think, in the fact that a centre of sort of Marxist medieval economic history and in Birmingham was to some extent getting substantial financial support as a result of I think the interest that English individuals.
My feeling is that the timing was different, because Hilton consulted me and sent.
You're probably right.
Sent his research assistants for that project to come and see me. Now, he certainly wouldn't have done that after the publication.
That's right. You're absolutely right. So, but I mean, maybe the irony comes in afterwards then, because the fact that this has been such an important sort of methodological sort of statement about the potential for court rolls, then you'd got interested in the results of it. That's right. You're absolutely right, Alan. I've got that wrong.
After that, we weren't on speaking terms.
Well, I mean, my relationship with him was very difficult. I did continue to have a link through an Israeli scholar, Zviratzi, who was one of his pupils who did careful work on manorial documents, although still very much, I think, within a particular kind of Marxist framework of analysis.
He never changed his mind.
Never really, although I did subsequently produce, I wrote some things jointly with him. He became persuaded that the manorial courts did absorb common law practices, and he got quite interested with me in why manorial courts became written in the course of the 13th century, when they'd been presumably oral curial arenas prior to that date, where we were arguing that this was entirely a stimulus from the emergence of written common law proceedings, and that the precedent sort of issues became dominant, and manorial tenants wanted courts that ran along not dissimilar lines to those of the royal courts, and that there wasn't this big divide between what was going on in the royal courts and what was going on in manorial courts, so in that sense, I did have a sort of small conversion of one Marxist into thinking. I always thought slightly more realistically about the way in which, and I always found it very, very difficult to understand how Marxist historians sort of conceptualised the countryside as almost like some kind of apartheid society where freemen and villains somehow were living in totally different sort of encampments, really, when the world wasn't like that at all.
And Maitland says, village is a tenure as well
Yes.
as a thing, and many people didn't know whether they were villains or not.
Absolutely. I mean, it was actually, in many respects, sociologically highly naive, really, when you sort of take away the layers and think of how they were thinking in these ways, and they were to some extent using a kind of rudimentary class warfare approach to the whole thing. But when you get down to the essentials,
Well, it's interesting, having just lectured in China. Sorry to go off a bit, but one of the audience, the editor of the press who's publishing it, said he found it very, very difficult to swallow what I was saying, and he thought many of the audience would find the same thing because they were brought up in the Marxist framework of medieval England. They did learn a lot about medieval England, and it ran contrary to all their prejudices, and they would need a lot of persuading to change their minds, because it was just a myth of origin of the modern world, which was deeply embedded in their consciousness.
yes.
And it's surprising that all this came to England, of course, but so it happened. Anyway, let's move on from my self-indulgent piece.
Well, it's now, what is it, 35 years ago now? It's a long time ago.
Time has moved on. Although they often ask me whether people accept, what I said, or to what extent, and I rather brazenly and bravely say, well, people will never admit that they accept some large-ish change in their paradigm, but generally a lot of it has been absorbed, and it's just now part of the air we breathe. And is that roughly?
I suppose it is. I mean, I would say that if anything, my views have not changed, but they've shifted somewhat to focus on what I would regard as the sorts of corporate institutions that, so to speak, go with individualism. So
Yes.
I become more interested in how manorial courts worked as a kind of an alternative to the family, or to other kinds of relationships based upon kinship, and especially in my more recent interests have been very much sort of reconsidering the way in which the local poor law is a kind of a correlate of a highly individualized type of social system. So those two things really, and I think there are people now who, particularly early modernists, who are interested in institutions that, so to speak, sit alongside societies with very, very thinly developed or weakly developed kin structures, who accept that now. They may not accept the fact that it was older than post 1601 or post 1598, but they acknowledge, and they acknowledge that these things don't just sort of begin at the end of the Elizabethan era and embed themselves later, but they have to think hard about this. And of course, there are still some who think that the poor law really was just a kind of a consequence of an early modern shift in family relations. And I suppose that sort of takes you back to some of the things that you did with witchcraft in the early parts of your sort of postgraduate career. Really.
I remember we had this discussion at the time, and this is the other great deficiency of individualism, as you pointed out, which is that with individualism, if it's so individualistic, you've got to have something to complement it in the day. And we discussed some sort of pension system, some sort of poor law provision, and so on, which I now, resting on you, assume that this is nothing to do with the Elizabethan poor law. I mean, it goes back well beyond that. Parish relief of various kinds is a medieval feature.
Well, and I think even though it's very difficult, given the nature of the evidence, to reconstruct these sorts of institutional forms, but parish guilds, manorial courts, even some of the collective arrangements that could be secured through legal devices did that. Of course, you're interested in some of Maitland's other interests in things like trusts really are all part of the same phenomenon, aren't they? I think that has has shifted a great deal. But of course, you've still got people who are interested in the poor law mainly from the point of view of a kind of left-wing sort of view about the way in which it works, and continues to sort of impose itself through various forms of disciplining of the poor, and as their primary interest. But that doesn't interest me. I'm actually doing something at the moment. I'm trying to look comparatively at the way in which the English old poor law sort of operates as a collective institution in ways that's very, very different from what you would find in large parts of the continent. Certainly in France and Italy. And of course, it gives you some sort of sense of why the parish is such a strong institution, I think, in an English context as well, comparatively speaking, with much of continental Europe, where you don't have that kind of entity. So the two things, I think, link up very, very effectively.
Have you linked this at all to the system of leaving home very early, this system of servanthood, apprenticeship, going to school, which takes children out of English homes at such an early age,
I know,
and throws them on the market, and from then on they don't come home, as was pointed out.
Yeah.
And this seems a medieval feature, as we know.
I agree, and it's a very durable feature too, isn't it? I mean, I know it's always difficult to draw a major contrast, but I mean, I've always been interested in more recent years in issues to do with the ways in which young adults in Spain and Italy don't leave the home. And as a result, I mean, one of the not the only reason, but one reason why young adult unemployment rates are so high in these countries is in part because they don't enter into a kind of broader geographical labour market. They hang around home for far longer, so those features just don't go away. They have very deep historic roots, I think. No, I'm really interested in that.
And it means, as I've been lecturing in China, that children's education, in the broadest sense of education, is totally different from France, Italy, and Spain, which is familistic. The morality, the ethics, the social attitudes are based on the family, whereas in England they're based on contractual relationship with school teachers and apprentice masters and so on and so on. So you learn to be a social being in England outside the family from 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah.
Even now our schools are like that, and I think you'd see a contrast with a French school. Yeah,
and the same applies to things like the extent to which people go to university in their home region or hometown, isn't it? I mean, something I know that there have been moves in the UK to try to cut costs by encouraging that kind of arrangement, but it seems to me that people like us should be telling governments that is deeply sort of hostile to something that's so deep in our historic sort of being, really, or over time, that it just...
The oldest institution in this country is the boarding school. I mean, 7th, 8th century Westminster was the first ones, and so it's going on. Anyway.
Okay.
So you joined the group. Tell me, you mention often both Tony and Peter. Tell me, well, let's start with Peter as the older one, who was a very important person in both our lives. Give me a little pen portrait.
Well, I mean, he was, I mean, everyone's sui generis, but there was something about him that was very unlike characteristics I'd seen in any other academic that I'd encountered. I mean, he was actually genuinely interested in what other people were doing. I mean, he did listen. He could be very dismissive, but there was something about his inquisitive nature which I always found very appealing, and he was particularly keen to talk to young people. There's no question about that. He was sort of exotic, really, as someone who had shifted his intellectual interests so fundamentally. I suppose you will all say he didn't when he was in his 50s. I mean, to have had that sort of...
From political science.
Yeah, and that always intrigued me, and that he could have this kind of relationship with with Quentin Skinner and John Donne, who respected him from that, who probably didn't respect his other work to the same degree, and thought that it was sort of somewhat naive. So, but he was very, very encouraging. He had a deep friendship with John Heinel. They were like brothers over their academic interests, and Peter took notice of what John Heinel said to him. I think there was one person who Peter listened to more. It was John Heinel on what they were doing, or he was doing. But he had a very distinctive working regime. I don't think he did very much lecturing in the faculty. I mean, we ran a population history paper at Part 2 in the history faculty for a period, and on the occasions when Peter was due to lecture, I literally had to go down to his room in Trinity at about 11:30 and ensure that I could take him over and escort him to the history faculty to his lecture. But when he went, I mean, he gave this unbelievable sort of performance, and there were quite a lot of people who of a slightly younger generation who write about their experience of Peter lecturing on family history and population history. But then he would come into the population group in the afternoons. He would write at home in the morning and go into Trinity late in the morning and have lunch in Trinity. Then he would come into the group usually about 2:00 and stay until about 7. And he'd done his writing for the day. I mean, he always did his 2 hours in the morning. So he would wander around talking to everybody. I mean, and if you were, it was quite infuriating at times, but these conversations were memorable. I mean, and he would come into your room and sort of say, "Well, what are you doing?" And or, "Have you heard this?" And then there would be tea, and he would continue this. And of course, the afternoons for him were just sort of brainstorming, really. And everybody else was trying to work while Peter was going around on this routine. And he always had lots of schemes that were underway, meetings of this, and he travelled a great deal. So he came back and always tell you what was happening in sort of Tallinn or with Jean Hamel in Berkeley or something like that. But was exceptionally, I think, important because while the Cambridge group continued to plough away on these big empirical projects that couldn't be rushed, the population history of England being a good example of that. I mean, Peter kept the group, so to speak, in the public eye by this high level of activity and willingness to get out there and sometimes make outrageous claims or statements, but it did enable Tony and Roger to take the time that was needed. If not, I think the funding bodies might have run out of patience. So he was a vital, I think, ingredient in this sort of mix of things. And of course, his interests in the social structure, his scepticism of certain forms of crude Marxist thinking, and I think his deep sort of appreciation of English empiricism as he saw it embodied in the work of people like Gregory King, who he regarded as sort of another form of the Cambridge group 300 years earlier, really. And I think it's very important when one thinks about that style of research in historical social science, I think. And I've never really been able to establish quite how it was that Tony and Peter came together. If you've interviewed Tony, he may have been able to elaborate on that point because their personalities are so different.
He was a student of Peter's to a certain
He was,
extent.
but in terms of their public persona, their reluctance to overstate anything, I mean, Tony is so different from Peter.
But they're both from the sort of not evangelical, the sort of Puritan, Methodist wing of English.
That's right. They have that in common. And of course, I suppose Roger Schofield being a Quaker too by background, even though he never looked a Quaker to me when I met him first. But that I mean, they were very, very important, and I always feel very privileged to have been able to work with them for so long, and still with Tony, who's remarkably productive and active now as he approaches 80. But Peter was the sort of the source of so many encouragements down particular pathways that I don't think I would have ever trodden. I mean, he got me interested in bastardy. He encouraged the work I was doing on on the European marriage pattern, and he got me interested in aging to some extent as well. So I am somewhat parasitic upon his initiatives. Tony has always been the person, though, I've worried most about in terms of anything that I write of a technical, analytical character. I mean, if I don't feel I've persuaded him that it's right, I just don't feel that I've made the case in any way that's at all plausible. Much more sort of thoughtful and careful in his judgment, but extremely polite. And you never know sometimes whether he really agreed with what you were doing. He would ask you some pointed questions. I mean, I remember him examining my doctoral dissertation with Joan Thirsk in his room in Peterhouse, and Joan had lost her watch down the side of the couch, which was clearly preoccupying her for a very high proportion of the viva, that she couldn't find it. But Tony was ploughing away with these incredibly difficult questions that he kept throwing at me, and I was trying to answer them while watching Joan Thirsk literally crawling under the couch, trying to find this watch that she somehow dropped. But a very interesting pair, really, to examine, neither of them being medievalists, really, examining a dissertation that was on a medieval topic. And those qualities that I saw in that viva, Tony's always, I think, possessed, and I've seen them in action right up until last week, when I was giving a plenary lecture to the economic history conference on the Pomerantz thesis. I was looking again at demographic attributes of England and the Yangtze, and arguing that Pomerantz had got it quite wrong as far as I was concerned, and that Tony came up to me afterwards and said something like, "Are you sure you know enough about the Yangtze to make these sorts of claims about the inaccuracy of Pomerantz's original work?" And I said, "Well, I only know what I've read, and I don't think he would have done that sort of thing. Partly because I don't think he is a kind of scholar who writes something by, to some extent, criticising what somebody else has done. I mean, that's not his sort of
there's very
mode
little
of
criticism
work. Yes.
in many of his books.
You won't see it. You might find an occasional footnote about something, but that he doesn't use it as a kind of a vehicle to launch an argument. But then he told me he thought I was right, so that was okay. But there was a sort of sense in which I know he would never have approached the issue in that in that way. But he continues to be a remarkable example of someone who is driven to investigate issues, and I suppose he's still very, very preoccupied with the distinctiveness of English industrial growth and change, and continuing to write interestingly on it, I think.
Yes,
and he's ensured that population history, I mean, as a sort of subdiscipline, is always engaged with larger questions. But it's never been a historical demography for its own sake, and I learnt that from him in particular. And that, if you're going to keep that kind of area of research activity going, you've got to ensure that it links into other bigger questions. And I think the areas of sort of historical demography that have sort of blossomed for a while in Paris, to a lesser extent in places like Berkeley and Michigan, in the United States, have lost their have really faded because they haven't engaged with these large questions. It may well be that we're very lucky in England to have, the Industrial Revolution and the distinctiveness of England's sort of economic trajectory as a sort of framework for investigating these things. So it does ensure that there's always a big question to which the demography and family history, in one form or another, relates. But of course, that ought to be a reason for a similar kind of success with East Asian sources. I mean, to some extent, the Japanese do achieve a little of that. And at some point, I imagine that we're going to know more about the Yangtze than we do at the moment.
Well, I've had some long conversations about it recently, but
I'm sure you
we'll come back to those. One of the exciting things about the Cambridge group, certainly in the 70s, was that there were other people in other related departments who were excited by what was happening there. I remember going to seminars where Geoffrey Hawthorne, for example, was a great contributor, and also Jack Goody.
Yes.
I wondered if you had anything to say, because Jack has told
I would say a lot about Jack, because, I mean, Jack, in my view, I regard him as a remarkable scholar, and I'm a great fan. We don't always agree, I think, on things, but the kinds of problems that he somehow pulls out of the bag to focus on are important. And he's been always supportive of the Cambridge group. In fact, I think one of these recent volumes he devoted to the Cambridge group and to Peter Laslett, and the kinds of issues that he's focused on. I know he has rather different views about family forms in East and West, and I wouldn't subscribe to his sort of views about the reasons why we have late marriage in Western Europe, or a distinctive marriage form. But they're big questions, and I think he is a kind of Max Weber of the late 20th, early 21st century. I may have told you this story before, but in the Academy back in some years back, when
British Academy,
when one of the sections divided, social anthropology broke away, had its own section with geography, and then sociology, demography, and social statistics. I happened to be chair of the sociology, demography and statistics section, and Peter Brown contacted me to say that Jack Goody decided he wanted to
be in your section,
have his principal section, and this was the early days of email, and I sent an email out to the members of the sociology demography section to say that I was delighted that someone I regarded to be the nearest equivalent to Max Weber, working in the British establishment.
WG Runson.
Well, I got a few surprised responses to my sort of, if you like, sort of allocation of Jack to that position. But I believed it, and I still do. I mean, I think when one looks at the corpus and the kinds of questions he's addressed, and his remarkable commitment to comparative approaches, I admire those qualities immensely, and I have always been a sort of signed up Goody fan, really, and one hopes that there are still people around who, sustain that kind of tradition. I don't know enough about Jack's pupils to know whether there are people who really will keep that particular torch, burning or alive. But he's been very, very important. And again, it was fortuitous in the sense that he was so influential in social and political sciences and social anthropology in Cambridge at the time that the group was really sort of getting off the ground. He was very, very supportive of that period, and I think a good friend of Peter's. They got on very well. They were both Jonians or whatever, and that I think said a lot. And I don't know. I mean, I suppose it would be I think something about that generation's experience that they'd had during the war and afterwards.
Moses Finlay was another one.
Yeah. Yes, Moses Finlay. I still remember going to a seminar that he gave. You may have been there in Peter's rooms in Trinity, when he gave a paper about whether there was senile dementia in the ancient world, based on looking at the sort of what he thought the average ages of major sort of Greek writers were when they were, and was quite convinced that they didn't have it. And there was a sort of venture into a sort of demographic analysis of the writings of figures, and Peter asked him where he had his where he got his aging evidence from. It was sort of typical Peter sort of argument. But Moses Finlay was another one of that generation, and there are lots of younger ancient historians who came out of that Finlay school and were moulded. Of course, there was Keith Hopkins here.
Yes, I was going to ask about Keith.
And Peter Garnsey.
Because I shared this room with Keith for 10 years.
Keith is another man I admire. I sort of lost a sense of his sort of where he was going and the kind of interest he had in the latter part of his career. But the work that he did, I'd say between the late 60s and the early 80s was
on Roman demography and
very good. And I still remember vividly 1981 or 2 it was that I for a number of summers I taught a graduate seminar at the Gulbenkian Institute in Wales, just outside Lisbon.
I did with Robert Rowland.
You did. You spoke in that, and for some reason, I have no idea why it came about. Keith had signed up for 3 weeks for this course. You spoke in it, I remember.
Yes.
And I had Keith every day as I was giving these classes, in the class. It was frightening to have him there, but it was very good, I think, for the class, and probably very good for me. Kept me on my toes, and because he was pretty sharp. Yes.
Knowledgeable.
But I'd forgotten that you were a performer during that week.
So had I. Okay, well let's come back to your career and so on. You were at the Cambridge group for some years. Then you went to All Souls.
Yeah, I went to a lectureship in. There was some concern that the group was probably going to lose its funding, and this post came up in Oxford, and Tony said he thought it would probably be a good idea to move. Take the opportunity that it gave. So I did apply for it and got it. I was then in my mid-30s, so I wasn't young. It was interesting. I mean, I don't think I really got historical demography off the ground in Oxford, but
there were Harrison and Boyce and people like that.
There were people in the physical anthropology group or in the biological anthropology group who were interested. Jeff Harrison was, Tony Boyce, and there were some very supportive social historians in the university who I taught with, like Paul Slack and Robin Briggs, and I taught a paper right through the period, actually, from the beginning to the end. I was there with Paul Slack on 17th century society. No, I'm not a 17th century expert in any form whatsoever. And I did the demography of social structure, family structure, part of it. Paul did poor law and towns and the other thing.
Okay.
And that was good. And I always found Paul very, very receptive to these sorts of issues. And he published during that period his first big book on the plague, which very heavily depended upon the sorts of methods that we were using. But for some reason, I got asked to sort of take over the Wellcome Unit for the History of Medicine after I'd been there about 4 years, when Charles Webster was elected as a senior research fellow at All Souls at the same time that Tony Wrigley was. It was a bizarre kind of moment, and I think that was a mistake. I mean, it did expose me to areas of sort of medical history with epidemiological associations that I subsequently found useful. But I always felt that the history of medicine, with the vast amount of research funding that was being made available to it through the Wellcome Trust, was investigating large numbers of questions of really no importance whatsoever. I mean, that's putting it rather strongly, but vast amounts of sort of funding was going in to support historical research of a rather mediocre significance. And I saw that. I ran that group for about 5 years and tried to move it more towards the sort of style of research that the Cambridge group undertook, collective projects where we worked together on themes. We had a good project with in fact now the wife of the Master of St John's.
Mary Abbott?
No, Mary Dobson.
Well, she is now.
Oh, Mary Abbott. Yeah,
it used to be Mary Abbott.
And then and that was good.
Mm.
And one project that I still remember vividly with the then wife of Charles Feinstein, a woman called Anne Digby, which we worked on an oral history of general practice. I hadn't done any oral historical work, and so it was new to me. And I got very interested in the shift in attitudes of general practitioners over the course of the establishment of the National Health Service in 1948. People who'd been in practice pre-48, those who came in just after 48, and those who came in later, and that was just interesting methodologically to do work of that kind. We collected a vast amount of information and interviews with over 200 general practitioners, with a research assistant I had working with me then. But that was finished, and then poor Roger had his first stroke, and Tony Wrigley, having been in Oxford for about 4 years, and a colleague in the college at All Souls, came back to take the chair of economic history and the mastership at Corpus, and I think somehow he managed to persuade the history faculty that they needed to create a post to replace Roger, who had been previously paid exclusively by the Economic and Social Research Council, and I got that job, and came back in '94 to run a group that was very different, because Peter was still actively engaged, even though retired formally. Roger, unfortunately, was a pale figure of his old self, even though he was still interesting to talk to, and Tony was then obviously preoccupied with running.
He was probably president of the British Academy.
He became president of the British Academy. He was master of Corpus, and I think sort of professor of economic history as well. So, but he still came in about 1 day a week. So the group wasn't the group that I had left in 1983-84, and we had now, without large-scale funding from the Economic and Social Research Council, because they stopped giving these big grants, I then had to run it really as a soft money research centre, collecting grants from all different kinds of places, but still trying to keep the interests of groups of people in rather similar related areas, it's still going. I don't think we have really big questions that drove the group during the 60s and 70s at the forefront of our activity. I don't think we've got anything equivalent to a major reconstruction of the demographic sort of history of the country. We don't have the sort of bigger projects that Peter undertook on ageing, but we still do a lot of work of a major kind, and on the demographic sort of correlates of occupational change, this huge project that we've been running over the last 4 years. I've been working, become more and more interested in the impact of large metropolitan centres on the epidemiological environments that they create, and the links they have with the economies and societies around them. So London's demography is something I have been working on with a series of grants, and I think that's very, very important. And I would want to argue, and that's what I was doing in this plenary to the Economic History Society last week, that the emergence of a large metropolitan centre like London in the 17th century, connected in all kinds of ways with international movements of people, goods and diseases, creates a totally new type of demographic regime in England, probably also to some extent in the Dutch Republic, that sort of sets it apart from anything that's happening in Asia at the same time. And it really creates a situation in which you can build up a very, very large number of individuals who have immunities to most of the major infectious diseases that enable adult mortality to come down in a dramatic way over the course of the 18th century.
That's your explanation for that decline, is it?
I know you've got other explanations that you have in mind, but
why hadn't it occurred in previous large conurbations in China, Italy, Spain, and so on?
Because I don't think their trading relationships were of a comparable.
Italy had a lot of trading relationships.
Well, I don't think they were to the same extent as expansive as the ones that London managed to, I think, achieve, and indeed Amsterdam and the Dutch cities. I mean, it is a remarkable sort of development that I think really sort of takes off around about 1680, 1690, and is common to. But it's not just common to London and Amsterdam. It eventually, I think, drags in northern France and much of the southern Scandinavia and Denmark and parts of West Germany. They all sort of start moving in the same direction, even though they're very, very different economically. I think their exposure to infections, particularly as they are associated with an initial deterioration in the life chances of the very young. That's one of the other things that happens, that infants and young children get much worse mortality. But those that survive, I would want to argue, are carrying huge benefits from a previous exposure, and it shows up in the ways in which mothers transmit those health advantages to the fetus and to the early. That's one of my arguments at the moment. One of the things I'm trying to sort of develop more fully. But I mean, that would be one of the arguments against why other large urban centres don't generate that kind of epidemiological shift. It may well be that we still don't know enough about the epidemiological attributes of some of these larger metropolitan centres. I mean, we are fortunate in being able to do this with London, even with given the ways that we've been able to devise means of doing family reconstitutions on London parishes, which was thought not to be possible 20 years ago because of the high migration and turnover patterns. But so of course we've got a lot of people who are doing work on the demographic correlates of the old poor law in different forms as postdocs and postgraduate students. So I think we're still addressing big enough questions, but my fear is whether we'll be able to continue to do that in the future, and whether the funding bodies will continue to look favourably on this kind of work. I mean, as you know, the department in which the Cambridge Group is now based has just established a chair in demography, and it would, I think, depend a great deal on who gets elected to that chair as to how this whole area will develop in the next decade, I think. So,
can I just finally, just in the last 5 minutes, 10 minutes, turn to one or two other questions which I always sort of like to ask. One is about how you think, creativity, and you've made a number of major contributions, and some people are not interested, and some people don't think about it, but I've always been interested in how people write, how they work, how they organise their field notes, whether they have punch cards, whether they use computers to write on, and so anything on writing, thinking methods that might be of use and interest to.
My method is a bit of a scattergun one, in the sense that I'm always interested in interconnections between bits and pieces that, and I write short pieces and try to organise them into some sort of more coherent form, but it's done not in the first instance as a kind of continuous piece of writing. It's done very much from the point of view of lots of bits and pieces, that a jigsaw which I then somehow am thinking about, and in the process of trying to write in a more coherent and integrated fashion, they get merged together. It's probably not a form of writing and thinking that is advisable. I mean, because there is a sort of a bit of randomness about it as to how these things eventually sort of cohere. Or but it's partly because of the way in which I think. I'm always thinking about an interconnection between some observation I've made in reading something or finding some piece of information, that connection with something else, and then I will think, there's a bigger set of interconnections here, and I have to work it out in this very, very fragmentary way. Whereas I imagine someone like Tony Wrigley has it all worked out in his head pretty well before he sits down.
You sound much more like Jack Goody, who works like in the way you describe, I think.
Yeah, I would find it very hard to do it otherwise, and it may well because I have a sort of a little boredom threshold that sets in. Once I've played around with a little thing, I then want to play around with another little thing.
I asked Lord Rees how it was he achieved so much, and he said, I have a short attention span.
Well, there's an element of that about it. I mean, but that's probably putting too favourable a gloss on the process, I think.
And do you find you write best at a set time, in a set place? Do you go for walks? Do you write by
I write best in the early morning and again in the early evening. I have periods in the day, particularly if I'm writing, and I tend to do most of my writing at home rather than in the office because of just too many disturbances. And I do pace around the house a lot when I'm writing. I eat a lot. I'm always munching on biscuits or, in between sort of paragraphs. It's a very restless sort of writing experience, I think I go through.
Did you enjoy it?
Oh yes. I mean, I don't find writing painful in that regard, although this sort of peripatetic sort of experience, pacing around the house, and is my wife always knows when I'm writing because I'm up and about, down for half an hour, and I'm up again and back again. But I know there are quite a lot of people who do write like that. Although I was quite surprised when I discovered. I thought there was something odd about this way of doing things, and then it couldn't really be regarded as serious because I thought serious scholars and writers who sat there and contemplated the page before them and or the screen before them for long periods and just produced it, because I think that's the way that Tony Wrigley does it.
I think it probably is. You mentioned that Peggy realised when you were munching your biscuits and wandering around you were writing, which brings us to Peggy. Do you have children? Or?
We don't have children, which is I don't quite know how that came about, really. We had plans to have children, and then Peggy decided to do a PhD in Britain rather late in when she was well into her 30s, and then it sort of just slipped off the agenda. I think I regret it. I think I regret it.
She probably does too.
Yeah, I think we both do because they are a great source of enjoyment, and you'd like to think that you're going to pass something on, really.
Well, there are other ways of passing.
Yeah, there are, but in a way, that may be a rather arrogant way of putting it because you may not like what you've passed on to your children, I suppose, which is always.
And Peggy continued to work as an archivist, or?
No, she did. She got a university post. I mean, in the University of Reading when we were living in Oxford, in history of printing, because that's the area in which she worked for a PhD, and she progressed to reader in the history of printing in the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication, but then decided when she was 60 that she wanted to retire, and she retired in 2004. We had a house in Reading and a house in Cambridge, and we wanted a house that was big enough to accommodate all our books, and we decided that we would like to move out of Cambridge, and we moved back down to, well, almost to where I was born, Clare, just on the other side of the river from the Hedingham, so to speak, and she's still researching but very, very actively involved in the local museum, and I have, for my sins, in the last year become involved in establishing a free school in Clare. You might not regard that politically to be an acceptable activity, but the quality of secondary education in South Suffolk is low, and the local authority was closing down our secondary school as it is this year. So a group of us decided to take advantage of the current government sort of legislation to re-establish the secondary school, which we're modelling on the sort of basis of a Cambridgeshire Village College. Three trustees, and I have been working almost 2 full days a week on this for the last 6 months, and I probably will do until we open the school formally in September. So it's a I suppose again, might not have done that if I had children, but maybe it's something that
it's another way.
Another way, right? So,
I mean, that brings us perhaps to the last question, which is about politics. You mentioned your parents were quite left-wing and organised meetings of the Labour Party and so on, and now you're taking on a project which actually is, I don't know what it is really, but anyway, it's more Cameron-ish, but anyway. But has politics been an important part of your life at all?
Not actively. I've never really been actively involved in any political party as a kind of practitioner or enthusiast. I'm interested in politics. I suppose I'm deeply sceptical of a great deal of what goes as political activity. I am very keen on what I would call sort of community activity in a broader sense. And I don't mean that in a big society Cameron sense.
Yeah, civil society stuff.
But I am interested in civil society and the kinds of institutions that somehow bring disparate sort of bodies and individuals together, so that you have some kind of sense of social coherence. And I mean, and parties vary a great deal in the extent to which they achieve that. I mean, I don't really like big government, but I don't either like highly individualistic sort of situations where there is no intermediate level. So I'm sort of interested in political processes that enable communities to somehow function effectively. And I suppose this school is supposed to be an example of a community-led school that will provide a set of facilities for a community and its immediate sort of hinterland of small villages. Really, it's rather modest interest, but
that's nice. Is there anything that you would have hoped I would have asked you, or that I have obviously missed, that's important?
Well, I suppose I wondered whether you were going to ask me about why I had somehow managed to move around between two disciplines, but although I expect you're too well informed to realise that I wasn't really doing that. It just so happened that the sorts of things that interested me could be more effectively undertaken sometimes in history departments and sometimes in geography departments. But there are some people who do regard this as a rather unusual, but you wouldn't, because of your moves between history, anthropology and everything else that you've done. And that I suppose it's because I don't really think that disciplines, when it comes down to it, are very important. But I was wondering, you asked me about the discipline as a sort of framework for undertaking or pursuing an academic career.
Study problems, not disciplines, as the man might have said, but didn't.
Yeah. But it sometimes doesn't. It's not always good for a successful career, because institutions don't like that kind of approach, do they?
No, you have to be very lucky to.
Yeah, and I've been very lucky. I have been exceptionally lucky in that regard, I think.
Well, that's a very nice note perhaps to end on, if that's okay with you.
Okay, fine.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you.